I graduated from the University of Cincinnati back in 1991 with a degree in graphic design. But, that was right in the midst of what I like to call the first Bush recession. And so graphic design jobs were a little scarce. So for the next 2 decades, rather than working in an art studio, I made my living as the manager of a retail bakery. This was a small specialty cookie shop. And I worked there, and I worked there with just only one other staff member to supervise most of the time. Over the years, my coworkers came and went because part-time employment rarely means long-term employment. For some reason, I was thinking recently about all of the people who helped me make and bake the cookies and wait on the customers during my time at the bakery. And one young man immediately came to mind. His name was Michael, and he lived in the poor, depressed, and often dangerous neighborhood just north of downtown Cincinnati, an area very much like what we call the West End here in Louisville. Michael was really smart, and he was good company. Unlike many other people who shared similar family and cultural backgrounds with him, Michael had been able to research and to document that his great-great-grandfather had been enslaved in southern Kentucky, and how a generation later his family had come to settle in Ohio and build a new life for themselves. During our time working together, I remember that Michael became very excited and emotional about 2 things. The first was the release of the very first live-action Spider-Man movie. The one with Tobey Maguire? He was a huge comic book fan, and he begged me to give him the day off from work on the Friday when it first premiered, so he could stand in line and go to see it at the theater, the very first showing of it. The other thing that got Michael really worked up was the U.S. invasion of Iraq. On the night before that war began, our then President, George W. Bush, had come to Cincinnati to give a nationally televised speech outlining his case for sending in American troops to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Now, my husband and I had been part of a big group from our Unitarian Universalist church at the time who went down to join thousands of protesters outside the hall where President Bush was speaking. This raucous crowd with signs and candles succeeded in blocking several streets, delaying the president's motorcade from leaving the venue for well over an hour. I found out the next morning that my coworker Michael was one of the people who had been briefly arrested for engaging in civil disobedience at that protest. Now, one afternoon, several weeks later, the two of us were taking a break at work together, and we started talking about all of this. Now, remember, these are the years right after 9/11. And my coworker Michael was alarmed and simply beside himself about everything that was going on. He asked, how could our country be invading another country with little or no real justification? How could our country be arresting and torturing people suspected of terrorism with no due process? How could our country allow warrantless searches and wiretaps of its own citizens? Despite massive public outcry, enormous protests, all of this was taking place anyway. To my young friend, it really felt like the end of the world. As we talked, I recall asking him about his family and their feelings about current events. He told me, well, my mom is as angry as I am, but she says that she's seen it all before. She lived through the civil rights protests, the sit-ins and bus boycotts of the 1960s. She remembers the whites-only water fountains. She says this is not good, but it could be worse. I told Michael about a close friend of mine from church, an elderly woman named Harriet, who had shared with me over coffee one day stories from 40 years ago about how she and some of her friends had set up a picket line and blocked the entrance to the local swimming pool to demand that they integrate. And another friend from one of the local gay organizations who had been at those anti-war protests outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. He told me that luckily he escaped unharmed, but he knew plenty of others who had been beaten and arrested. As we talked about history and about those we knew who had lived through it, Michael seemed to come to a realization. He told me, I guess all this just means that whether I like it or not, it's my turn to step up and to speak out for what's right. Just as generations and generations before me have done when they had to. This realization seemed to bring him a sense of perspective and focus, and maybe even a little peace. Now, this conversation happened over 20 years ago. A year later, Michael decided to go back to school to get his GED and enroll in community college. And after he left the bakery where we worked together, I lost track of him. Today, if he's still with us, Michael is probably in his mid-40s. And over these decades, all of us have witnessed presidents come and go, wars waged, pandemics and recessions arrive, giving us the wisdom of hindsight about what was one crisis or another from a different time. We have, of course, also seen same-sex couples getting legally married right here in Kentucky. The fall of long-standing dictatorships in places like Syria and Tunisia, and all kinds of folks driving around in electric cars, putting solar panels on their houses. Things that 2 decades ago seemed to many almost unimaginable. Over the years, we have also said final farewells to many of the people that we have known, people whose stories and experiences of their time, of stepping up and speaking out for what was right, have had a lasting impact on us and how we understand our place in the world and how we engage with our own adversity. Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Alice Walker once wrote, "To acknowledge our ancestors means we are aware that we did not make ourselves, that the line stretches all the way back, perhaps to God or to gods. We remember them because it is an easy thing to forget, that we are not the first to suffer, rebel, fight, love, and die. The grace with which we embrace life, in spite of the pain and the sorrow, is always a measure of what has gone before." On this Memorial Day weekend, we are remembering lives lost, carrying in our hearts many folks who are no longer physically here among us. They are reminders that we do not live isolated within a moment of history. We do not face our challenges, our joys alone. We are always a part of a greater human story, a story of struggle and triumph, of hurt and happiness, of injustice and liberation, a story and a life that we cannot escape, control, or avoid, but is also not ours to bear alone. You know, I grew up hearing about how my grandfather had served in World War II. His name was the Reverend C.J. Hogan, and he served as a radio operator on a battleship in the Pacific Ocean and talked a lot about his time at sea. Only much later did I learn more details about my granddaddy's military adventures. At the time of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he was too old, technically, to be drafted. But the story goes that in a fit of patriotism, he drove down to the recruiting office in Mobile, Alabama, and volunteered to join the Army, or the Navy, I should say. This was a spur-of-the-moment decision, and it did not please my grandmother. She had not been consulted beforehand, and she was extremely upset that he had decided to leave her alone with two very small children. His service was a real sacrifice for his family. And fortunately, my grandfather survived to return and make things right. He passed away at the age of 99 back in 2015. But up until his very last days, he was a storyteller. During his final years, he developed advanced dementia and health issues, but he could still tell you all about a particular football game that he had played as quarterback of his high school team. He could tell you all about the weeks that he spent working 12-hour days in a cotton field to earn money to support his wife and his children. He could tell you all about his 6 months stint as an appliance salesman, a job that he had to quit because of the predatory practices of the management. They would loan out refrigerators to very poor families out in the country, and then they would charge them huge interest fees. He told me, I really, really needed that money, but I just couldn't do that to folks. His stories always left me with a sense of reverence for him, knowing all that he had been through in his life. They also gave me a sense of perspective about those things that I was going through in my life, for better or for worse. Knowing my grandfather has not made things easier for me necessarily. Our challenges are not that similar, and our circumstances are quite different. But it has made everything at least a little more tolerable at times. It's given me perspective. As we recall our ancestors, as Alice Walker refers to them in our reading, be they parents, grandparents, spouses, friends, family members, or maybe just heroic figures from our history, those who have lived and passed on, leaving behind so much for us, may we know that we are not the first to suffer, rebel, fight, love, or die. And we will not be the last. Our stories, our ability to rise to the occasion, to sacrifice for others, to be a force for love amidst oppressions, that might just serve as inspiration for someone, somewhere in the distant future. When I think about my grandfather, I feel proud to be his grandson, even with all the mistakes that he made and the hard lessons he learned. And I want to live in such a way that wherever he is now, maybe he might be proud of me, even when I don't live up to my expectations. And to me, that's the best way to honor his memory, the best way to carry him with me. Later today, we are going to be gathering right over in Weston Hall to celebrate the life of Anne Dorsbeck. Anne was a beloved longtime member of our All Peoples community who passed away earlier this month. She leaves behind a lasting legacy here in so many ways. And it is going to be a joy for us to be together and to share some time of stories and memories of her with one another. We're also going to have some good food, some things that Anne loved, and a very special dessert to share as well. So we hope you'll come back and join us this afternoon. It starts at 4 o'clock, right, Margie? 4 o'clock over in Weston Hall. My friends, as we go out into the world this coming week and connect with others who make us glad and experience things that break our hearts, may we remember that we do not encounter any of it alone. For as Alice Walker wrote, the grace with which we embrace this life, in spite of the pain and the sorrow, is always, always a measure of who and what has gone before. Amen. And so may it be.